They were laughing before she ever broke the seal, and Runa should have known then. The letter had come into her hands in the middle of the wool room, where she had been since before light, and the red wax on it was so bright against her gray fingers that for a moment she could not make her eyes leave it. Behind her the loom stood half-strung. In front of her stood her two stepsisters, Katla with her arms folded and her chin down, Hedda already pink in the face with the effort of holding something in, and the pair of them looking at her the way two cats look at a bowl they have just knocked toward the edge of a table. "Well," Katla said. "Open it." Runa turned the letter over. The wax was stamped with a wolf beneath a full moon. She had seen that mark twice in her life, both times on a proclamation nailed to the mooring post at the bottom of the village, and both times from far enough back in the crowd that she had to take the reading of it on trust from the people in front. It was the seal of the Alpha King of Ravensguard. It was not a thing that came into a wool room. It was not a thing that came to her. "It has your name on it," Hedda said, and her voice cracked upward on the last word. It did. Runa Torgeirsdottir of Isvik on the Silverwater. Her whole self, written out in ink by somebody who had bothered to know it. She did not know that the hand which had written it was standing 3 feet away with its nails bitten to the quick. She did not know that she was holding the beginning of the worst night of her life, and the beginning of the rest of it, and that the two would turn out to be the same night. She knew only that her name looked strange and beautiful in ink, and that her heart had begun to go too fast, and that after 4 winters of being spoken to as though she were a bench or a bucket, somebody somewhere had written her name down on purpose. She broke the seal. To hear how a life turns over on a scrap of wax and a lie, stay with me by the fire. And if these frostbound vows are the kind of story you have been looking for, follow along, because I have a great many of them left to tell. Now, to understand what that letter did, you have to understand what Runa was in Isvik. And to understand that, you have to go back 4 winters to the morning the Silverwater took her father. Torgeir had been the best shipwright on that stretch of the fjord. A broad, slow-speaking beta with sawdust permanently in the creases of his hands, who could look at a curve of green oak and tell you what shape it wanted to be in 20 years. He built boats for men who paid him late and sometimes not at all, and he never once pressed them, because he said a man who has to be chased for a debt is already carrying a heavier one somewhere you cannot see. He went out in a fair sky in the first week of the thaw to bring a new hull down the coast, and the wind came around off the mountains the way it does there, without any warning at all. And it took him and the boat and 2 other men, and the fjord kept all of it. He left behind a haul of good timber with a hole in the roof he had been meaning to mend, a young woman of 16 winters, a stack of unpaid work, and a wife of 11 months named Alvild. Alvild had come down from a hard little holding up the valley with 2 grown young women of her own and a way of smiling that never went past her mouth. Runa had tried. That first year, she had tried hard, because her own mother Ranveig had been gone since Runa was small, and there was a place in her that had been standing open ever since with nobody in it. She had shown Alvild where her mother's spindles were kept. She had shown her the loom. And Alvild had looked at the loom, the great upright loom of ash wood with the half-finished cloth still hanging on it, and had said, "That thing takes up half the wall," in the voice of a woman making a note for later. Then the sea took Torgeir, and the smiling stopped altogether. The debts came out of the walls of that hall like beetles out of a rotten log. Every man her father had ever carried arrived to explain, with great sorrow, that of course he would pay, only not this season, and every man her father owed arrived to say he was extremely sorry, only he would need it now. Alvild sat at the head of the table with a tally stick and did not weep once, and by the end of that winter she had bought up every claim against the hall with the last of her own coin, so that there was exactly 1 creditor left standing in Isvik, and she was living in the house. She showed Runa the bond paper by firelight, the way you show a dog a stick. "Your father drowned owing," she said. "The hall answers for it. You are the hall. Until it is paid, your hands are mine. That is the law, and it is written, and I will keep the writing safe." Runa was 17 winters old. She did not know then how much a person can be made to carry if you hand it to them one morning at a time. That was how the heir of the house became the servant of it, not with a decree, not with a locked door, only with a bond paper in a carved box and a great many small mornings. She rose first, raked the ashes, fed the fire, hauled the water up the icy shore path, and carded and combed and spun and wove. Because Alvold had discovered quickly that the one thing of value in the whole hall was the young woman's hands at that loom, and that fine gray cloth out of Isvik would fetch a good price from the traders who came up the water in the autumn. Runa wove until her shoulders burned. She wove cloaks for men she never met, and blankets for beds she would never sleep in. Alfield sold every ell of it and wrote the takings in her tablet, and somehow the debt in the carved box never got any smaller, and no one in the village ever thought to ask why. They did not ask because of the other thing about Runa, the thing that had been said about her since she was 15, when the village first began to notice such things. She was an Omega who could not be scented. Now, in the fjord country, that mattered more than money. Everyone knew how it was supposed to go, and Omega came into her own around her 16th winter, and thereafter carried her scent the way a hearth carries its warmth, and Alphas noticed. A young Alpha came near, and went still, and went stupid, and after that there were only details to arrange. Katla had 3 men circling her by the time she was 19. Runa had nothing. Alpha after Alpha had come near her at the autumn markets and the winter feasts, and every one of them had leaned in a little, the way they do, and then straightened up with a puzzled, faintly embarrassed look, as if they had reached for a cup and found the table bare. "Nothing there," she heard one of them say to another, outside the smokehouse, when she was 17. "Like putting your face in cold water." The village settled on its explanation within a season, because a village always does. She was hollow. She was unlucky. The fjord had taken her father and left something incomplete behind. Old women told each other, in the pleasant lowered voice people use for other families' misfortunes, that Randveig had gone too early and the lass had never finished. The way bread does not finish if you open the oven. The name that stuck was the kindest one and the worst one. The quiet one. Not cruel, just final. A woman the wolves cannot smell is a woman no alpha will ever claim. And a woman no alpha will ever claim is a woman who will card wool by somebody else's fire to the end of her life. And everyone in Isvik had agreed on that for her before she was 20. She had agreed with it herself. Mostly, that was the part that hurt in a way she could not have said out loud. Not the mockery. She had grown a callous over the mockery. It was the agreeing. Only, some nights, she still went up. Behind the hall, there was a bank of rock above the water where the pines broke, and you could see all the way up the Silverwater to the mountain. And on the clear nights of midwinter, the great pale moon came up over that mountain so enormous and so close that it did not look like a light in the sky at all. It looked like something leaning down. The old people called it the Frostmoon, and there were 100 sayings about it, and the one Runa's mother had used was this: "The Frostmoon does not choose the loudest. It chooses the one still awake." Runa went up to that rock the way other people go to a shrine. She did not pray, exactly. She stood in the cold with her arms wrapped around herself, and she let herself want things for a quarter of an hour, and then she went back down and banked the fire. And she kept weaving her own cloth. That was the secret, if she had one. On her mother's great ash loom, in the hours after the household slept, Runa had spent 4 winters weaving something that was not for sale. It was a mantle, wide enough for a tall man's shoulders. in undyed gray and white, and worked into the gray were figures she had made up out of her own head. A wolf walking, and above the wolf a full moon. And the border all the way round in a running pattern of pine and water. It was slow, and it was foolish. She had no man's shoulders to put it on. She had begun it in the first black winter after her father drowned simply because her hands needed something to do that was hers. And she had kept at it because a person has to have one thing in her life that no one else has the right to sell. It was 3/4 done. Nobody knew it existed but old Gerd, who had served Torgir's mother and was now half blind and slept by the wool room door and covered for her, and who said every single time she saw it, "That is a king's cloth. That is," and cackled, and went back to sleep. So that was Runa. On the morning the letter came, 20 winters old, in a mended gray gown, with hands like a woman of 40, and a wolf half-woven in the dark. Now, the letter. 2 days before, the king's men had ridden into Isvik, which had not happened in living memory, and had nailed a proclamation to the mooring post, and half the village had stood in the sleet to hear it read out. The Alpha King of Ravensgard, Sigurd Ulfgerson, was calling a choosing at midwinter. It was the talk of every hall on the Silverwater within a day. He had held the high seat 5 winters and had not taken a mate, and people had begun to discuss that in low voices, with worry underneath. Now the word had come down the fjord. At the Frostmoon, Ravensgard would open its doors. And every unmated omega of the fjord country, high or low, was called to come and stand in the king's hall, and the king would walk among them, and if the old bond woke in him, he would name her before the whole court, and there would be an end to the waiting. High or low. That was the phrase everybody chewed on. There were Jarl's heirs up the coast who had been groomed for that hall since they could walk, and here was a summons that put a village weaver in the same room with them. In Isvik, it meant one thing above all. It meant Katla was going. The hall turned itself inside out for it. There was a bolt of saffron wool that had been meant for market and was now, suddenly, not for market. There was a silversmith fetched up from the next village. There were 9 days of Alvild standing over Runa's shoulder at the loom saying, "Finer, finer, this is not a horse blanket," and Runa working until she could not close her hands, weaving a gown for the sister who would be presented to the Alpha King, and telling herself steadily and sensibly that she did not mind. She minded on the 8th night. She was carrying the folded saffron cloth through the hall, and Hedda said, not even unkindly, just as a fact, "It is lucky you cannot go, Runa. You would only have to stand there while he walked past you." And Katla, who was the clever one, looked up from the fire and did not laugh. That was the moment. Runa did not know it, but Katla told it herself years later, and she always started there. Katla looked up and saw her stepsister standing in the firelight holding a gown made for somebody else, with her face doing that thing it did, which was nothing at all. And Katla felt something she did not enjoy feeling. And instead of putting it down, she picked it up and made a joke out of it. Because that is what her mother's household had taught her to do with anything uncomfortable. She was good with a pen. She had been taught letters by a priest on the hill because Alvild believed a woman who could read a tally could not be cheated by one. She had good wax, and she had seen the king's seal on the proclamation at the mooring post, close up. Because she had pushed to the front the way she always did, and a wolf under a moon is not a difficult thing to cut into a bone button with a knife if you have an evening and no conscience. She wrote it that night, and she did it well, and it is worth saying exactly what she wrote, because everything that came after turned on it. It said that the king had heard of a weaver in Isvik, whose cloth was spoken of as far as the high hall. It said that he desired her presence at the choosing at the Frostmoon, personally and by name. It said she was to come to Ravensgard on that night, and stand forward when the court was assembled, and present this letter and claim what had been promised to her. Claim what had been promised to her. That was the barb, and Katla knew it when she wrote it, and Hedda squealed into her sleeve when she read it. Because a woman who walks into the greatest hall on the Silverwater in front of 600 people and announces that the Alpha King has promised her something is not merely mistaken. She is presuming on the high seat. It is the kind of thing men have been put out of the door for. In the old days, it was the kind of thing men were put out of the country for. They would let her walk the whole 11 miles up the fjord road in the cold. They would let her stand up in that hall. And the two of them would be standing in the crowd in good wool with their hands over their mouths. That was the joke. That was all it was ever meant to be. So when Runa broke the seal in the wool room with her heart going too fast, and read her own name in ink, and looked up with an expression that neither of her stepsisters had seen on her face in 4 winters, Katla found that her mouth had gone dry, and said, rather sharply, "Well? What does he say?" And Runa, who had not been given a single unearned thing since she was 16, said the sentence that Hedda would repeat all the way up the fjord road, and would stop repeating forever afterward. She said, "He knows about the cloth." There were 4 days between the letter and the Frostmoon, and they were the strangest 4 days of Runa's life, because for the first time since her father drowned, the household was pretending to be kind to her. Alvild did not forbid her to go. That surprised the sisters, and it frightened Runa more than a refusal would have. Alvild simply looked at the letter for a long moment with her jaw set, and then handed it back and said, "Then you will go, and you will not shame this hall," and turned away, and Runa did not see the look that went between the mother and the elder of the two over her bent head. Alvild had recognized her own kin's hand in the 3rd line. She had decided in the space of a breath that a woman who is publicly ruined at Ravensgard is a woman who will never again lift her chin in Isvik, and that a bond servant with no chin left is worth more than one with hopes, and she let it run. So they were kind. Hedda offered to dress her hair. Katla, who could not look at her directly, said the gown would want airing. The gown was her mother's. It had been folded in the bottom of the cedar chest since Ranveig was lost, wrapped in linen with sprigs of dry juniper in the folds, and when Runa lifted it out, the whole room smelled suddenly of a person who had been gone for 14 winters. It was wool dyed the deep blue-black of the water under the pines, with a narrow band of red thread at the cuffs and the throat. And it had been made for a taller woman, and it was the only beautiful thing Runa had ever owned. She spent 2 nights taking it in, the way her mother had taught her, small stitches doubled at the stress points. The seam allowances left generous under the arms and down the sides, so the cloth could be let out again by whoever had it after her. She pressed it with a smoothing stone, rubbed the salt bloom out of her mother's old shoes with candle grease, and braided the strip of red wool she had woven for herself 2 winters before into a belt, the way the women wore them in Isvik. And on the last night she sat on the edge of the sleeping bench with the finished gown across her knees and cried for about as long as it takes to boil water, quietly, so as not to wake old Gerd, and then washed her face and went up to the rock above the water and stood under the moon that was not yet full. She said out loud, "I do not want him to choose me." That was true, in the way the biggest lies always contain something true. She did not expect to be chosen. She had lived 20 winters inside a body no alpha in the fjord country had ever been able to find. And she was not going to that hall for a crown. She was going because a man she had never met had heard about her cloth and had written her name down on purpose, and for 4 days she had been able to walk through a house where she was furniture and think, "Somebody out beyond this water knows that I make something good." That was the whole of it. That was all she wanted out of Ravensgard. One person in a high place who had looked at a length of gray cloth and thought, "Whoever wove that is worth a letter." The morning of the Frostmoon came up hard and blue and cold enough to make the timbers of the hall crack like knuckles. They left her the ashes to rake, and the water to haul, and the bread to set, because Alvild said there was no reason a feast should mean the fire went out. Runa did all of it fast, with her hands shaking, and then went to the wool room to dress and found her stepsisters waiting to help her. That was when they did it. It took Hedda perhaps 40 heartbeats, and Runa never saw it happen. Katla stood in front of her, holding up a bronze mirror the size of a saucer, and kept her talking. "Do you want the braid crossed over? Or down? Turn to the light. No, the other way." And Hedda stood behind her with the little sewing knife she had palmed from the basket, and went along the long seam under the right arm and down the right side and cut the stitches. Not all of them. That was the cleverness of it, and it was Katla's idea. And Katla never once tried to pretend afterward that it was not. If you cut the whole seam, the gown falls apart in the house. You cut every second stitch, from the underarm down to the hip, so that the thread holds while the wearer stands still and dresses and walks out into the cold feeling perfectly well, and then gives out gradually over 11 miles and a great many stairs, in front of exactly the audience you have chosen for her. Then Hedda said, "Oh, and your cloak. I hung it out to air, and went and got it from where it had been hanging since dawn on the fence above the shore path, where the wet salt spray came up, where it had frozen into a board that could not be bent, let alone worn." Runa stood in the yard, holding a cloak like a plank of wood. Her breath went out white. The sisters were already in the sledge with the good furs over their knees and Alvald's hand up for the driver, and Katla was looking straight ahead at the pines with her jaw very tight. And Hedda called out, in the friendliest voice in the world, "You had better start now, if you mean to be there before dark." And Runa, who could have sat down in that yard and let the whole thing go, and would have been perfectly justified, and would have spent the rest of her life carding wool by that fire, and never known what she missed by an hour, did the thing she did. She rolled the frozen cloak up under her arm to thaw against her body as she walked, tied her mother's red braided belt tighter, and started up the fjord road on foot. Now 11 miles is not far, if the road is dry and the day is long. That road was neither. It ran up the eastern shore of the Silverwater in and out of the pines, over 3 shoulders of hill that each looked like the last one, and the light in midwinter up there lasts about as long as a good conversation. She walked it in her mother's shoes. The first 3 miles were almost joyful. She was warm from moving, the sky over the mountain was the hard, clean blue you only get at that temperature, and she was going somewhere, which she had not done in 4 winters. There is a particular happiness in simply being on a road, which people who are free to travel never notice at all. The next 3 took the joy out. The wind came down the water into her face, the thawed cloak was now merely wet, the cold got in through the wet, and the road climbed. Her mother's shoes had been made for a woman who did not walk in them. She stopped twice to rub her feet and did not look at them, because looking would not help. Somewhere in the 7th mile the light began to go blue, and she said her name out loud to keep her mouth working. She said, Runa Torgersdottir of Isvik. Then, after a while, she said, "He knows about the cloth." And it was in the 8th mile, at the top of the 3rd shoulder where the road came out of the pines onto a flat white shelf with the whole fjord opening below it and the first stars showing over the mountain, that she came around the rock and found the wolf standing in the middle of the road. It was enormous. She had seen wolves. Everyone up there had seen wolves, at a distance, going along a ridge in single file at dusk like a rumor. She had never seen one at 15 paces, standing square in her way, silver gray down the back and white through the ruff and chest, with its breath going up in 2 slow columns and its eyes on her. Every sensible thing she knew told her to back into the pines. The cold went through her properly then, the deep kind that comes from inside. But she was tired past sense, and she had 11 miles in her legs, and there was a thing about the animal that her body understood before her mind did, which was that it was not hunting her. It was just standing there. Its ears were forward. Its tail was neither up nor down. It looked at her the way an old woman looks at you across a market when she has decided to see what you will do. So Runa did not run. She stood still, and after a moment she heard herself say, in the flat, exhausted, conversational voice of a person who has stopped being able to be frightened properly, I am not going to fight you. I have not got it in me tonight. The wolf's ears moved. I have 11 miles of road in me, Runa said, and a gown that is my mother's, and I am expected at the king's hall. If you can believe it. And if you eat me here, nobody will even come and look for me until the cloth is due. The wolf sat down. It sat down in the middle of the road like a dog by a hearth, and the whole shape of the night changed. Runa laughed. It came out of her cracked and strange and made her cough, and it was the first laugh she had produced in a very long while. She came closer, because at that point there was no reason left not to. And when she was near enough, she saw that the animal's ruff on one side was matted into hard gray clots of ice and snow, packed in down to the skin the way it gets when a beast has been lying out through a thaw and a freeze, and she thought, without any decision in it at all, that it must be pulling at the hide. She crouched down in the snow in her mother's blue-black gown, an arm's length from a wolf's head, and she said, "Let me. I am good at knots. It is the only thing I am good at." And then she worked the ice out of that ruff with her bare fingers, piece by piece, the way you work a tangle out of a fleece, warming each clot in her hand until it let go. Talking the whole time in the low-nonsense voice her father had used with skittish horses. The wolf let her. At one point it turned its great head and put its nose against her wrist and left it there, and Runa's throat closed up entirely, because it had been 4 winters since anything living had touched her on purpose. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and got out the strip of dried fish she had been keeping in her sleeve, which was the only food she had brought, and which she had been going to eat at the top of the hill. She broke it in half. She ate her half. "There," she said, laying the other half on the snow. "Now we have both had supper, and neither of us has had enough." And a voice out of the pines behind her said, "She will take it from your hand, if you let her." Runa came up off her heels so fast she nearly went over backward. He was standing about 10 paces off at the edge of the trees, and he had been there for a while, and he had been so still that she had walked past him twice over in her mind without ever seeing him. A big man. Big through the shoulder in the way that makes a road narrower. He wore a plain deerskin coat gone brown-black with weather, a woolen hood pushed back, and no color on him anywhere. Dark hair worn in the long braids of a fighting man, a dark beard with gray coming in early at one corner of the jaw, and a white line of an old scar through his left brow. There was an axe at his belt of the plain sort every man up there carried for wood, and a coil of rope over his shoulder, and snow on him. A lot of snow. The amount that settles on a man who has been sitting outdoors for hours because he wanted to. "She is yours," Runa said. It was not a question. The wolf had turned its head toward him and had not otherwise moved. "She is her own," the man said, "but she comes back to me. Mostly, I did not do her any harm." No, he came forward a few steps, unhurried. His voice was low and came out slow, as if he had got used to being the only one talking and had stopped bothering to hurry. "You did her a kindness, and you did it before you knew who she was. Not everyone would trouble." "It was in her ruff," Runa said, and found she was explaining herself with unusual urgency to a stranger in the dark. "It would have pulled all night." "Yes," he said, "it would have." And he looked at her for a moment in a way she could not read at all, and then he said, "You are on the road late. I am going up to Ravensgard." His mouth moved slightly. "The choosing." "Yes, on foot," he said. "From where?" "Isvik." He was quiet for a beat too long. "That is 11 miles. "I know how far it is," said Runa, with a little snap in it, and then, because he had not deserved that, "I am sorry. Yes, it is 11 miles, and it turns out that the last 3 of them are the ones that matter. He almost smiled. She saw it go across the lower half of his face and disappear. "Sit down a moment," he said. "You are shaking. There is no sense arriving anywhere in that state." And that was how Runa came to be sitting on a fallen pine at the top of the third shoulder of the fjord road, at the hour the Frostmoon came up over the mountain, with a wolf lying in the snow at her feet, and a stranger she took for the king's houndsman crouched at the other end of the log, feeding a small fire he had built out of nothing in about the time it takes to tell it. He gave her hot water out of a leather flask with something bitter and green steeped in it, and he did not ask her a single question about herself for a long while, which is the rarest kindness there is. He asked about the road instead, where the ice was bad, whether the bridge at the second shoulder had been mended, and she found herself talking, and going on talking, and she blamed it afterward on the cold and the water and the dark, but that was not it. It was that he listened as though what she said would be used for something. Somewhere in it she told him about the letter. She got it out of her breast, wrapped in a scrap of linen, and held it out flat on her palm in the firelight like a person showing a bird's egg. The red wax caught the flame. "The king wrote to me," she said, and heard how it sounded, and rushed on. "Not a proclamation. To me. He has heard of my cloth. I weave at Isvik on my mother's loom, gray and white mostly. And it goes down the coast with the autumn traders, and it seems it has gone further than I knew. And he wrote and asked me to come." The stranger did not take the letter. He leaned in and read it where it lay on her hand, and the firelight moved on his face, and he read it twice. Runa watched him do it, and could not think why the back of her neck had gone cold. When he sat back, whatever had been in his face was gone, put away somewhere with the door shut. "Do you know the king's hand?" he asked. "I have never seen it. I have never seen anybody's hand but the priest's and my own." She folded the letter with enormous care and put it back inside her gown. "Why?" He was quiet a while, looking at the fire. Out over the water the Frostmoon had come clear of the mountain, and the whole fjord below them had gone the color of a knife blade. "Because a letter like that has a great deal writing on it," he said at last. "And whoever sent it knew that. She should have heard it." She thought about that a great deal afterward. Whoever sent it knew that, he had said. And she had been too cold and too happy to take the shape of the sentence apart. "You think somebody is having sport with me," she said. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are about to walk into a hall full of people who have been rehearsing for this night since the autumn, and that you have walked 11 miles to get there, and that of the two of those. The second is the one that ought to be written down. That is not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it is not." He stood and kicked snow over the little fire, and the dark came back in around them, and the Frostmoon took over the road. The wolf got up and shook herself. "Whatever happens in that hall tonight," he said, "do not turn round on the stair." "What?" "The stair up to the doors. It is long, and it is lit, and everyone in the hall can see it. People lose their courage halfway and turn round, and then they have to live in this country afterward with everyone knowing they turned round." He pulled his hood up. "Go all the way to the top. Whatever they do to you at the top, you will have gone all the way up. You talk as though you know what they will do to me at the top." "I know what halls are," he said. She got up, and her feet had stiffened, and she made a small noise she was not proud of. He put out a hand and she took it, and his grip closed round hers, and it was so warm that she actually made a sound at that too. Her hands had not been properly warm since the sledge left Isvik. "You are ice through," he said, and there was something under it now, something with an edge. And Runa did not understand until much later that it was not directed at her at all. "I am all right. You are not." He let go and unwound the long gray woolen scarf from inside his collar and put it into her hands before she could refuse it. It was heavy and soft, and it smelled of wood smoke and pine and something underneath she had no name for. "I cannot take this. You can bring it back to me," he said. "And then it is not taking." She stood in the road holding it. Something was pushing up under her breastbone that she had no room for tonight, and she pushed it down and said, briskly, "What are you called?" He was already 3 steps into the trees. "You will be told," he said, "before the night is out." Ravensguard, when she came around the last shoulder, stopped her in the road. She had never seen it, and nothing anyone said about it had prepared her. It stood on the black rock at the head of the Silverwater where the fjord narrowed, a gray stone keep with the old timber long hall built out from its flank, and every window of it was lit. And the light came out yellow across the snow for 100 paces. There were pine torches in 2 ranks all the way up the great stair, and the sledges were coming in below, and the horns were sounding up on the wall, and above the whole black mass of the mountain behind hung the Frostmoon, so vast and so near that the towers had shadows. Runa stood in the trampled snow at the bottom with her mother's shoes full of ice, and looked up the stair and understood with total clarity that she did not belong there. Then she started up. It was 31 steps. She counted them because counting was the only way she could keep going, and she went up between the torches in a blue-black gown gone gray to the knee with road salt and slush. With a wet hood and a stranger's gray scarf round her neck, past women in marten furs and men with silver on their arms, and every single one of them looked at her, and every single one of them looked away, and nobody said a word to her at all, which is the loudest thing a crowd can do. She did not turn round on the stair. Inside, the heat hit her like a wall and made her eyes stream. She had not imagined that many people could be under one roof. The long hall of Ravensguard ran the length of an ordinary village, and it was full, and it was gold. Fires down the middle in 3 great pits, iron candle trees at every pillar, the roof beams lost in a warm haze of smoke, and light coming off everything. Off silver, off gold thread. Off the wet furs of 600 people who had come in out of the cold. It smelled of roast meat and pine resin and hot ale and wool. And down the northern wall, where the tall shuttered windows had been thrown open onto the fjord because of the heat, the winter came in long, cold blue bars, moonlight and snowlight, lying across the floor in stripes over all that gold. The Omegas were being gathered at the western end by the steward's men. There were perhaps 40 of them. Runa saw at once how it worked, and how it had always been going to work. There were the Jarl's heirs from up the coast in cut velvet and marten, standing in a knot with their chins level. There were merchants' maids in good dyed wool. There were studding women in their best. Scrubbed pink and terrified, but scrubbed. And there was one who had come in off the road on foot, with a hem like a wet rag and her hair coming down and her mother's shoes leaking. She did not go to the western end. She stood in a doorway behind the last pillar, out of the light, and she did what she had done all her life, which was become a piece of the furniture. And she pressed the letter flat against her breastbone under her gown, and she said to herself, without much conviction, that when the moment came, she would go forward. That was where Hedda found her, of course. Hedda had been looking for her for an hour, and Hedda had drunk 2 cups of the king's ale, and Hedda's whole night depended on the finding. There she is. Hedda's voice went up over the crowd like a gull. Katla, she came. She is here. She came all the way. Katla arrived out of the press in saffron wool with the silver at her throat, and looked at her stepsister, and Runa saw her face do something complicated. "Come away from the wall," Katla said. It came out low and fast. "Come and stand with us. Stay with us, and it will pass off. I am to go forward when the court is assembled." "Runa," Katla's fingers dug into her arm. "Stand with us." And Hedda, who had never in her life understood that her sister said one thing while meaning a second, laughed and said brightly to the 6 or 7 people nearest them, "She has a letter from the king. You know. She has come to claim what she was promised. There is a way that a rumor moves through a crowded hall. It goes along the pillars first, then it crosses in the middle, and then it comes back to you from the far end. Changed. Within 100 heartbeats there were people standing on the benches to see, and the phrase coming back down the hall was, "The weaver of Isvik says the king promised her." Jarl Steinar came through the crowd like a plow. He was the king's uncle on his mother's side, and had run that hall since before the king could walk. A heavy, gray, deliberate man in a bare brown cloak with the steward's chain on him, and he had a horror of disorder in general and of scenes in that hall in particular. "Who is making this noise?" "She is," said somebody helpfully. He stopped in front of Runa. He looked at the hem, and the shoes, and the wet hair, and Runa watched him make her out to be exactly what she looked like, which was a poor woman at the end of a long road, and he was not unkind about it. That was the worst part. He said, "Quite gently, lass, whatever you have been told, go and stand at the west end with the others, and no more of it." And Runa, who could still have stopped, took out the letter. "I was summoned," she said. Her voice came out thin in all that space. "By name. I am to present this." The Jarl took it because it had the king's seal on it, and no man in that hall could have done otherwise. He turned it to the candle tree. He read it, and Runa watched his face change, and it did not change into anger, which she had braced for. It changed into the pity of a man who has just understood something before the person in front of him. Then he looked at the wax. He looked at it for a long time. He put his thumbnail against the edge of it. He tilted it to the light and turned it, and the whole hall was going quiet in rings, the way water goes quiet. And Runa stood in the middle of that spreading silence with her heart going like a bird in a box. "This wolf has 5 toes," said Jarl Steinar. Somebody laughed. One person, up on a bench, a single bark of it, and then it caught. "The king's wolf has 4, the Jarl said, louder, over the noise, holding the letter up. "And his moon sits above the shoulder, not the head." This seal was cut by somebody who saw the proclamation at a distance. He lowered it and looked at her with that terrible gentleness. "This letter is forged, lass. The king did not write to you. Somebody in your own house has made a fool of you and sent you up the fjord road to do it in front of me." And the Hall of Ravensguard laughed. It is worth being exact about this, because it is the hinge of the whole story. It was not cruel laughter, most of it. It was 600 warm, well-fed, drunk, relieved people discovering that the strange, tense thing in the middle of their feast was, after all, only a joke, and joining in the way a crowd does, without malice, without any of them meaning her the smallest harm. That is what it is like. That is the thing nobody who has not stood in it ever understands. Nobody in that hall hated her. They just all laughed at the same time. Runa stood in the blue bar of moonlight from the open window with the gold roaring all round her, and heard the sound go up into the roof beams, and her seam gave. It went the way Katla had designed it to go, gradually, from the underarm down, thread after thread, until the whole right side of her mother's blue-black gown opened from armpit to hip, and the sleeve slid off her shoulder and hung, and she was standing in front of 600 people in the ruin of the only beautiful thing she had ever owned, holding it closed with one hand. The laughter changed pitch. That was when it got teeth. Somebody in the crowd said something about the cloth of Isvik and how it was a pity it did not hold together, and that got the biggest noise of the night. Runa looked down the hall. She found her stepsisters at once, because they were the only still points in all that moving light. Hedda scarlet and shrieking with her hands over her mouth, and Katla white as tallow, not laughing at all, one hand out toward her as if to stop something already finished. And Runa understood, all at once, the whole of it. The 4 kind days, the gown airing, the mirror held up in front of her while somebody stood behind her, the cloak on the salt fence, her own name in ink, written by a hand she had watched at that table for 4 winters. Something went out of her that had been holding her upright since she was 16. She turned to go. Not out of the room, even, only away, toward the dark of the doorway behind the last pillar, one hand holding her gown shut, with her face doing what her face always did, which was nothing at all, and the noise of the hall going over her like weather. And a voice from the high seat said, "Stand where you are." It did not shout. That was the thing about it. The hall of Ravensguard was 300 feet of shouting, and it went through all of it like a bell through fog, and the laughter came apart in the middle and fell over itself into silence. Runa turned round. At the eastern end, past the 3rd fire, there was a dais of black stone with a high seat of carved ash on it, and behind that seat there was an arch that led away into the keep, and a big man in a plain deerskin coat gone brown-black, with weather had just come through that arch with snow still melting on his shoulders. She knew the shape of him before she could see his face. She had watched him build a fire out of nothing in the dark 2 hours before. He came down the 2 steps of the dais, and the whole eastern half of that hall went down as he passed. In a wave, jarls and housecarls and marten-furred women folding down like grass under wind, and Jarl Steinar took 2 long strides and set his hand to his breast and bowed his grey head, and said, in a voice that carried the length of the roof beams, the king. And out of the arch behind him, unhurried, came a great silver-grey she-wolf with white through her ruff, who walked down off the dais and across the open floor of the hall through 600 silent people, and lay down in the blue bar of window light at Runa's feet, and put her head on her paws. Runa did not kneel. She was not able to. She stood in her ruined gown in the middle of the floor with a wolf lying across her wet shoes, and the grey scarf still round her neck, and watched Sigurd Ulfgerson, Alpha King of Ravensguard, walk the length of his own hall toward her, and the only thought in her head, going round and round like a bird in a box, was, I told him about the cloth. I sat on a log and told him about my cloth. He stopped an arm's length from her. He did not touch her. He put out his hand, and Jarl Steinar laid the forged letter into it, and the king looked down at that scrap of paper with its 5-toed wolf for what felt to Runa like half a winter. Then he lifted his head, and he did not speak to her at all. He spoke to the hall. The seal is false, said the Alpha King. The summons is not. Nobody in the hall breathed. This wax is a lie, he said, and held the letter up so the whole roof could see it. It was cut by somebody who wanted sport. Every one of you laughed at it, and I heard you from the stair, and I will remember which of you laughed loudest. He lowered his hand. But the letter says a weaver of Isvik was called to this hall by name, and that she was to come and claim what was promised her. Hear me. She was called by name. She has come, and she will claim it. He turned then and looked at her properly for the first time since the road, and he said, only to her, in the low, unhurried voice of a man crouched at the other end of a fallen pine, you did not turn round on the stair. You knew, Runa said. Her own voice did not sound like hers. On the road. You read it, and you knew it was false, and you let me walk up here anyway. I did. Why? Because if I had told you on that road, he said, you would have gone home. And whoever did this would have won, and would have gone on winning for the rest of your life, in a house where nobody would ever have known what was done to you. He set the forged letter down on the black stone of the dais step, carefully, as if it were worth something. I wanted it done here, in front of all of them, where it can never be taken back. Then he came closer. He came 2 steps closer, which put him near enough that she could see the melted snow in his beard, and he stopped, and Runa watched the Alpha King of Ravensguard go completely still. She would not have known what it was. But 600 people in that hall knew. and the sound they made was not laughter. It was the sound a crowd makes when the roof beam cracks. Jarl Steinar said, out loud, like a man punched. Sigurd shut his eyes. He breathed in once, slowly, the way you do when you have come in out of a long cold and there is bread in the house. Say your name, he said. Runa of Isvik, Torgir's own. Runa of Isvik. He opened his eyes. Do you know what they say of you down that water? That I am hollow. She said it flatly. She had said it to herself so many times that it came out smooth as a worn step. That no alpha can scent me. That I am the one the wolves cannot find. Yes, he said. I have been listening to that for 2 winters, and it is the reason I am standing here. When a scent is faint, my lord, they told me. When a scent is faint, it means the woman is unfinished. And I said nothing, because I had no way to tell them what it truly means, having never met it. He looked around at his own hall, at all those faces, and there was something close to anger in his patience. My grandmother knew. It is in the old telling, and nobody reads the old telling anymore. There is one kind of Omega that no alpha in the world can scent. Not one. Not at a hand's breadth. She is not hollow. She is not unfinished. She is spoken for. From the hour she comes into herself, she is silent to every wolf on the earth but one, because she was never theirs to find. The blue window light lay across the floor between them, and the wolf at Runa's feet lifted her head. I have walked through markets and feasts and half the halls on this fjord for 5 winters, said the Alpha King, and I have never once smelled anything but wool and smoke. And I had begun to believe the bond was a story the old people told to make the winters shorter. And then I sat on a fallen pine in the dark 2 hours ago, downwind of a shaking, half-frozen, stubborn woman who was pulling the ice out of my wolf's ruff with her bare hands, and I could not breathe. He said, "You are not the one the wolves cannot find. You are the one who was mine to find. And they told you for 4 winters that meant you were worth nothing." Runa stood in the middle of that hall with the ruin of her mother's gown held shut in one fist, and found that she could not see, and would not for some while wipe her face in front of 600 people. "You wanted to know what I am called," he said. "I know what you are called. Then say it, and stop looking at the floor." "Sigurd," she said. And the Alpha King of Ravensgard, who had not knelt to anything since his father's pyre, went down on one knee in his own hall in a weather-stained deerskin coat, in front of a village weaver with a torn seam, and the whole of that court went down after him like a wave going up a beach. It should have ended there. It very nearly did. But Alvild had come in from the western end with the crowd, and Alvild had spent 4 winters making sure that whatever else happened in this world, she would not be poor in it. And she pushed her way to the front of the kneeling and said, in the clear, reasonable, carrying voice of a woman who believes the law is a friend of hers, "My Lord King, she is not free." Somebody hissed. She did not flinch. Her father drowned owing, and I hold the bond upon this hall and upon her hands until it is paid, and it is written, and witnessed, and lawful, and no one, not even the king, takes a bonded servant out of a house without settling what is owed. Sigurd rose. "Name it," he said. 11 marks of silver, said Alvild, and the interest of 4 winters, which brings it to 19. Steinar, pay her 19. My lord, pay her 19, and then send a man down to Isvik in the morning to look at her tallies. Because a hall that turns out fine gray cloth for 4 winters and still owes 19 marks is a hall that has been writing its numbers with a very warm hand. Jarl Steinar's mouth moved under his gray beard, and he bowed. And it is said in the fjord country that Alvild of Isvik went white at that exact moment and stayed that color for about a year. "And the letter," said the king. The hall went quiet again. "Whoever cut that seal," he said, "stand out." Nothing moved. And then, from the middle of the crowd, in a voice that came apart in the middle, a young woman in a saffron gown said, "I did." Katla came out into the open floor and stood there in the light of the 3 fires with her hands empty and her chin up, which took, whatever else you want to say about her, more courage than anyone had ever expected of her. I wrote it. I cut the wax on a bone button. My sister did the seam under her arm, and the cloak was my doing as well. Nobody else in that house put a hand to it. Her voice went. She was standing there holding a gown I was going to wear, and I could not bear her face, so I made it a joke instead. That is the whole reason. There is not a better one. Alvild said, Katla, in a voice like a gate closing. The Alpha King looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the thing that they still tell in that country, in halls where nobody remembers a single other word of the story. "Then you have done me a service no man in this kingdom has managed in 5 winters, said Sigurd. You put her on that road. I would have grown old and unmated king in this chair and never gone 11 miles down my own water to find her. And you sent her to me on foot. In the cold, in her mother's gown, on the one night of the year I was out on that road, because I could not stand the noise in here." He picked up the false letter and turned it in his fingers. "It is the cruelest thing I have ever been grateful for. You will keep your life, and your name, and you will spend some part of both making it right, and I leave the size of that to her." He held the letter out to Runa, and Runa did not take it. She stood in the blue bar of moonlight with her hand still holding her gown shut, and she said, quietly enough that only the nearest 30 people heard, and every one of them repeated it. "I cannot do this here." Sigurd's hand did not move. "Say it." "They laughed at me," she said. "All of them. Every one of them in this room laughed at me 2 minutes ago, and now they are on their knees, and it is the same 600 people, and the only thing that changed was you." Her voice was shaking badly now. "If I take that letter tonight, then for the rest of my life I am the joke that turned out well. I have been the thing people talk about since I was 16 winters old. I will not be it again in a better gown." She put the gray scarf into his hand instead, folded, the way you return a borrowed thing. "I am not saying no to you," she said. "I am saying not like this." And Runa of Isvik walked the length of the hall of Ravensguard through 600 silent kneeling people, and down the 31 steps between the torches, and out into the snow. Nobody stopped her. It is said that Jarl Steinar started forward, and that the king put out one hand and held him where he stood, and stood watching the doorway long after there was anything in it, with a scarf in his fist and a she-wolf gone from his side. The wolf walked her home. 11 miles, in the dark, at her hip the whole way. She reached Isvik somewhere in the small hours. And the hall was black and cold because there was nobody in it to keep the fire, and she raked out the ashes and built it up again with hands she could not feel, because that was what her hands did. Then she went into the wool room, and lit one candle, and stood in front of her mother's great ash loom. The mantle hung there, 3/4 done, gray and white, undyed. The wolf walking, the moon above the wolf, the border of pine and water running all the way round. She had made it for nobody. She had told herself that for 4 winters. She sat down on the bench in a ruined gown at 3 in the morning, and she picked up the shuttle, and she wove. She wove until the candle drowned and the window turned gray, and then blue, and then gold. She wove the last of the border and the last of the moon, and she cut it off the loom at the middle of the morning. And she was sitting there with the whole weight of it across her knees, too tired to be anything at all, when the wolf lifted her head off the hearthstones and looked at the door. There was no horn. There was no company. There was a knock at the door of a cold hall in Isvik, and when Runa opened it, the Alpha King of Ravensguard was standing in the snow, in the same weather-stained deerskin coat, with no man behind him and no crown on him, and 11 miles of road on his boots. "You walked," she said. "It seemed to be the going rate," said Sigurd. He did not come in. He stood on the step with his breath going up white, and he said what he had come to say, which he had evidently been assembling the entire way down the fjord, and it was this: "I do not want a queen out of that hall. I want the woman who fed half a strip of dried fish to a wolf on an empty road when there was nobody in the world to see her do it. That is who I found. That is who I am here for. And I will come down this road every week until midsummer if it takes that. And I will keep coming when the whole country is laughing at me instead of at you. And then we shall be even." Runa stood in the doorway of her father's hall for a long moment. Then she lifted the thing off her arm and shook it out, and it opened between them in the snowlight. Wide enough for a tall man's shoulders, gray and white and undyed, a wolf walking, and above the wolf a full moon. "I have been weaving this for 4 winters, she said, "for nobody. It never once occurred to me to wonder who I was making it the right size for." And she put her mother's cloth around the Alpha King's shoulders on the step of a cold hall in Isvik. With nobody watching but a wolf and an old half-blind woman who had come to the wool-room door and was pretending to be asleep and telling everybody about it for the next 20 years. They were bound under the Frostmoon at the turn of the year, on the rock above the water behind her father's hall, because Runa would not do it at Ravensgard, and Sigurd never once asked her to. Perhaps 40 people stood in the snow. He wore the gray mantle with the wolf on it, and he wore it every midwinter after that until it was more mending than cloth. The forged letter was not thrown away. It sits in a carved box in the keep at Ravensgard to this day, they say, and the king had the false wax lifted and his own true seal pressed over the top of it. The 4-toed wolf under its proper moon, so that the 2 of them are stamped one on top of the other. A lie with the truth pressed down over it, and neither one letting go of the other. Alvild kept her 19 marks and lost the hall, because the king's man came down and looked at her tallies, and what he found in them was enough that she went back up the valley to the hard little holding she had come from, and was not spoken of much afterward. Hedda married a fish trader at Nordvik and told the story wrong for the rest of her life. And Katla, who had cut the seal, was set to the loom in the wool room at Isvik, and told she might buy her way out of it with cloth, and she was still at it 4 winters later, and had got, by then, unexpectedly good. As for the one they had called Hollow, the one no wolf on that water could find, she made a law before she had been a queen a full season. And it is the only one of hers anybody still quotes. No summons out of Ravensgard was to be sealed in wax alone. Every one had to carry, beneath the seal, a strip of woven gray cloth, because wax can be cut by anybody with an evening and a bone button, said the queen. But no one can copy a hand at a loom, and there ought to be one thing in this world that cannot be faked by a person who means you harm. That is the second of the Frostmoon vows. And if you have ever been the one they laughed at, in a room where nobody quite meant it, and had to stand there and hold yourself together with one hand, then understand what the moon understood that night. The joke was true after all. She was summoned. They simply did not know by whom, and neither did she, and neither, until he came down out of the pines and could not breathe, did he. Stay by the fire. There is a pendant lost in the snow, and a woman weeping alone under this same moon with someone standing behind her, and I mean to tell you all of it.